Hello and welcome to another video on chess.com in this series about mating patterns. I am Fyrirmaster Ingvar Johannesson from Iceland, and we're going to continue our discussion about mating patterns. And I have two new patterns for you in this video. However, I don't really have a name for them. Everybody knows smothered mate. You know what do we do? Arabian mate, Bowden's mate. It's a kind of more well known, but I haven't really seen a name for this one. So sometimes I call this the Karpov joke for reasons I will show you later. But okay, this is like usually we have a skeleton for the pattern, and here we need the bishop to take control of the diagonal. The knight gives a check, and this has to be captured, otherwise it would be checkmate. Only move, and this opens the h-file, and here you see how the rook and bishop cooperate to deliver the mate. I've set it up slightly differently here. I put the queen on the long diagonal just to demonstrate that for this pattern to work, we can use a queen or a bishop on the long diagonal, just so that we have control over g8. Again, the knight gives a check on g6, and of course the knight can be anywhere. f8, e7, e5, f4, h4, any square that reaches g6. It gives a check, the diagonal is opened. This time we can't go directly and give the checkmate. But the power of this pattern is such that if black has no way to block the long diagonal or the h-file, then we can simply wait, make a quiet move and threaten the mate, and sometimes that's enough. As you can see, g5 doesn't help mate, and king h7, rook h1 mate. The most famous example of this mate is probably this one, and it's Anatoly Karpov with white against Taimanov. We're going to look at it from the black side, and this is the reason why I call it the Karpov joke. Taimanov executed this pattern accidentally with knight g3, and Karpov resigned. He can take on g3 with the queen, which would kind of ruin our pattern, but then black simply takes the rook on b1 and is completely winning. And the huge point of this move is that Karpov can make the move h takes g3, because, like I said, if white can't interpose on the long diagonal that the queen controls, then there's simply no defense against the mate on the h-file, which is common here. Rook h8, next move. So Karpov had no choice but to resign after the strong move, knight g3. So you can call it what you like. If you have another name, then I welcome you to post that in the comments, but for now I suggest the Karpov joke. Another example, this time executed by the late great Soviet player Efim Keller. And here he's tweaking it a little bit. We're not going to have a knight check on g3, we're going to have a queen sacrifice on g3. But it accomplishes the same thing. It lures the white h-pawn to the g-file, and now all we need is something on the h-file to deliver checkmate, and that's easy, g5. As you can see, nothing can block on the a7 to g1 diagonal that the bishop controls, and therefore we have time for this maneuver to simply play g5 and threaten the mate. And also no piece can interpose on the h file. So this works beautifully. Again, slightly more complicated example. Here black used a variation of our pattern to win materially here. And for this one, you should pause the video and try to find the solution. Assuming you came back, the solution is queen takes c2. A beautiful move. The only point of this is to open the powerful diagonal here with d3. Please note that rook takes h2 is a mistake, because after d3 now, threatening rook h8 mate, white actually has g4, which prevents the mate because it opens up the square on g2, and now white would be winning after something like this. Simply picks up the pawn and he has an extra exchange, so be careful there, small trap. However, after d3, there's no defense. If you try to save your queen, you get checkmated, and if you allow us to take the queen, well, obviously you have lost material. Even a move like a5, we can just make a waiting move like bishop d4, so that doesn't even help. So if white tries to save the queen, then rook takes h2. And usually in our pattern we get double pawns on g2 and g3. But note here that since we have control over g3 with our pawn on f4, this comes out to more or less the same, doesn't it? Did I go over? No, okay. So this one is actually taken from a game that I played. I got to execute this mate, this pattern once. I took on d3, and here, to my intense pleasure and delight, my opponent played the horrible blunder knight to c6. And he couldn't help but smile when I executed the obvious move. Obvious to you by now, of course, knight g6. And my opponent resigned. So these patterns, they do crop up in your games from time to time. Here a slightly tweaked example. Black blundered horribly with d takes e4, which looks good, threatening the rook and opening the diagonal for the black bishop. However, this also dangerously opens up the diagonal for the white bishop. We've seen in this pattern how dangerous that is. White answered, assuming you paused and came back, knight g6. And what to do? First of all, if he tries to run away with the king, queen takes h7. Slightly different, but it's checkmate. And if he takes, then we kind of have a pattern, except that we add a little extra to it with the queen sacrifice here to open the h file. And now the rook comes over. Black can only interpose once, and now we have checkmate. In this example, which is very similar to the example from my game, black has the h3 square under control, as you can see. So white went for it. He simply doubled on the h3 square, and black completely fell for it. He takes d4, completely overlooking the easy knight g6. And he had to resign because now white can just check on h3 and then come back to h3, and it's checkmate. Always be aware that if black can interpose something, here he can actually interpose. If we're clumsy, play knight takes g6, pawn takes, and queen h3, we're gonna see knight h7. However, in this case, it's quite okay because we also have queen h4. And now, as you can see, if black interposes now, then the queen on e7 is hanging. So watch out for your opportunities, but also be aware of any piece interposing. And if it can interpose, then see if you can take advantage of it, like here. Here the long diagonal is blocked by the rook. However, it should be easy to get rid of that. White played knight takes g6. King g8, then we simply checkmate immediately. Rook e8, double check and mate. And if pawn takes, then we, well, there are actually two ways to go. You can play queen h4, then rook e8. I like rook e8 first, because now we control the long diagonal and we have sort of a clean version of our mate here, queen h4. Even very strong players have fallen for this. With the black pieces here, Frank Marshall of, well, most famous for the Marshall Gambit. Actually, there are many Marshall Gambits. The most well known in the, well, that's called the Marshall Attack in the Ruy Lopez. There's also a Marshall Gambit in, I think, the Slav. Anyway, he played knight takes g3, but should be clear to you now that knight g6 is coming. And this works, of course, because we can take on g3, opening the h file. And there's only one move to interpose, and then checkmate. On we go, on we go. Should be very familiar to you by now. I really like this example. White is usually doing okay with rook and two minor pieces against the queen. Here, however, black has plenty of pawns. The white king is slightly exposed. But he found a nice way to take home the victory. Can you find it? This is very similar to our skeleton position, the second one. Knight g6 check, pawn takes. And now simply the calm, king g2. Protects f2, and a quick inspection will reveal that there are no queen checks for black. So rook h1 is coming. Nothing can be interposed on the long diagonal, and black is going to lose. He has to give up his queen. Queen f4, he can only interpose it here. And, well, the example is more or less over here, but I found white's play here nice. He didn't, just took his time. There's no rush to take the queen. Black has no moves. Just improves his king. And then when the time is right, he's going to take on h6. And actually, black just resigned here. He's going to lose. We'll take on h6, and then we create a pass pawn. But a nice shortcut to the victory to know the pattern with knight g6 here. Here is a rather famous example out of Andersen with white against Max Lange. And I would say he used the Karpov choke here to get the win. He played knight g3. Pawn takes. And now, like you know, all we have to do is threaten mate in the h file. He did that with queen g5, threatening h6, and as you can see, g1 is firmly under control, and nothing can interpose on the diagonal. Okay, simple threat, only one defense. Rook f5. He played h5. Excellent move. Now if rook takes g5, h takes g4. It's going to be checkmate on the h file. G takes h5. Now h5 is protected by an x-ray, but the rook on f5 not, so he takes. And again, he threatens mate, taking on h5 with either piece. Only one defense, g4. He took again, and again he threatens the deadly mate. Again he tries to interpose, only one defense, but unfortunately he's gonna be mated. But it's a different mate. He used the carpal choke to sort of get all the concessions, and finally he delivered this mate in the end, which I believe is called Max Lange mate, and we'll look at later. The end sequence here, bishop g1, and then coming back to g3. Sorry, back to f2 to close out g3. That's the Max Lange mate that we'll look at later, but that's a small preview. This is the final example of this carpal choke technique. Here many players might go for material. White went b4 here, and many players will go for material here, but after having watched countless examples, I'm sure you can find the quickest win here. With the black pieces, Jessica Harmson in the European Championship under 20 found knight e2 double check, king h1, and knight to g3, forcing the resignation because mate is coming on the h-file, as you should all know by now. And therefore, we're going to move to another pattern. And this is the skeleton for the pattern. Again, the bishop on the long diagonal. This time we have a pawn on g5, supporting a queen on h6, which delivers checkmate. I don't know the name of this one. I'm thinking about calling it Capablanca mate, because we have one example of Capablanca giving this mate back in the days in an Olympiad, and let's indeed look at that example. World champion Jose Raul Capablanca with the white pieces, and he arrived at our skeleton after rook takes h7, king takes, queen h3 check, king g7, queen to h6, checkmate. Notice the bishop on the diagonal, the pawn supporting the queen, and the queen taking care of the rest of the squares. Another excellent example of this mate was delivered in this game, where the Dutch Grandmaster Daniel Stelwagen had black. And obviously he knew the pattern, and he found a brilliant win here. He took on g3. White does nothing better than to take, and now a powerful move, e4. Opening up the diagonal for the g7 bishop, which is important, as you'll see. Bishop d4 check. King g2, and after you've seen the skeleton, and after our future examples, this will be very familiar. Rook h2, king takes, and now the queen is simply coming to h3. And again, our pattern, bishop on the long diagonal takes care of g1 and f2, the pawn takes care of f3 and the queen takes care of the rest of the squares. As you can see, checkmate. Again from the white side, and very much like the other examples, like the Capablanca one, rook takes h7. He has to take, and queen h3. Exactly the same stuff. And here, exactly the same, only a double rook sacrifice. And I was impressed with this one because with the white pieces, was a little Spanish girl playing in the Spanish Under-12 Championship. So they are working on their mating patterns in Spain, it seems. Queen h6 checkmate. I'm not sure. I'm sure many players would not have found this had they not known about the pattern. Maybe they would, but knowing the pattern always helps. Black found a nice combination here. He played knight f4 check. White's best is actually to retreat, but that's looking pretty bad for him. He took on f4, but that's actually worse because it leads to a forced mate. Rook takes on h2, king takes, queen h4 check, king g2. Notice now that this diagonal of the bishop is blocked by a pawn on f2, and therefore queen h3 is obviously not made because of king g1. So for this to be made, we simply need to get rid of the pawn on f2, and that's easy. Queen takes f2 check. King back, king h1, king g2, and we have arrived back at this position. Only we removed the f2 pawn, and therefore queen h3 is our pattern, and a checkmate, the Capablanca mate. Another nice demonstration by black here. Similar to the last one in that we need to remove the f2 pawn. Once again, always think about pausing and finding the solution for yourself. And this one is slightly more complicated, but not much. Knight f3 check. This has to be taken. King f1, queen takes f2, that's easy. So white took. But now, just like in the last example, we get rid of the f2 pawn, come back, and then queen h3 mate. And of course, notice the importance of the g4 pawn giving support to the queen. Another example from the white side, pretty straightforward. Black has 2 pawns, but white is very active and defends the job with rook takes h7. King takes, and same stuff. The same stuff. Here, obviously white didn't see the pattern. Black just played bishop takes g4. And white got greedy. He took on g4, thinking he's winning a piece. Because after king g2, black can't double on the h-file. That's probably the only thing that white saw. He thought, he can't play queen h7, can't play queen h6. So I have time for rook h1, and then I can interpose with the queen when the queen makes the check on the h-file. However, this is exactly like the Stellwagen example. Rook comes to h2. We're used to many examples with rook takes h2, but of course rook directly to h2 accomplishes the same. But somehow I find it slightly more aesthetic to have no pawn and put the rook there. King takes is forced, and now we're just coming and giving the Capablanca mate. And this is our last example, which I found pretty nice because it seems like black is doing okay. He's threatening queen h2 and queen h1 mate, and he has a dangerous e-pawn, but his fate is familiar to us already. Rook takes h7. King has to take, queen h5, and the checkmate on h6. Very efficient use of all the forces. Nice coordination of the pieces. So this was the last example. So we looked at what I choose to call the Karpov choke, and then this one, the Capablanca mate. Please feel free to suggest other names if you have some historic resources that have other names, or if you just want to suggest something else. Anyway, hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something, and hope to see you soon with more mating patterns. Bye bye.